Hi, I'm SPFDJ. I'm a DJ originally from Sweden, but I live in Berlin now. I started DJing about 10 years ago when I bought my first turntables. I was at university in Sydney at the time, on a year abroad away from my home university, which was in Leeds in the UK. At the time, I had absolutely no ambition to become a professional DJ. I was just really passionate about music. I was going out to raves a lot, listening religiously to radio shows and some live streams, in the chat rooms a lot. So after a while of mixing in my bedroom at home, I started playing back-to-back with friends at after parties. And then I had moved to London, where I started a collective with 5 other women called Universa Tang, where we threw our own illegal warehouse raves, and we didn't book any other artists, we just DJ'd ourselves. So that's where I got some of my first experience DJing in front of crowds. Small crowds, but anyway. I then moved to Berlin, which was actually not at all to start a career in DJing. I had got offered a PhD position in extragalactic astrophysics at an institute in Potsdam. Unfortunately, my PhD didn't really work out. I quit a few months in, but that's when I started focusing more on music. So to start off with, I just uploaded a couple of mixes on my own SoundCloud, and that led to a couple of gigs, one of which was at Herrensauna, thanks to a friend of mine who sent them my mixes. I then started a monthly radio show on Kashmir Radio, inviting other guests, as well as playing myself. We even did an interview once. I also was working part-time for a small sound system company here in Berlin, setting up a fairly sizable Function One sound system at events around Berlin. We also threw some of our own parties with it, and this time booking other artists too. So I then guested on NTS and Rinse FM before starting my own monthly Rinse show, where I continued to invite more artists onto the show. And I played a couple more times for Herrensauna before they asked me to become a resident, which then led to the 2018 Boiler Room, which kind of launched my career, to be honest. At the same time, I also started my own vinyl label, Intrepid Skin, releasing music by people and cool artists that I'd met on my journey at gigs or by throwing parties. And the label got off to a good start, and that definitely helped my career as well. So I think one of the things that helped me on my career path was taking my own initiatives to launch my own projects. So between throwing illegal warehouse raves and legitimate raves and starting radio shows, starting my own label, that was very important. And none of this was actually career-driven either. I did this just because I was passionate about electronic music, and I wanted to take part in the scene, contribute to it, as well as also support other people in the process. Another thing that really helped me on my career path was some connections that I'd made from being a raver in Leeds, London, and Sydney. So I'd met some people who were in the industry who then noticed my mixes when I uploaded them, and they reached out. So for example, Ben UFO, who invited me to come onto the Hessel Audio Show on Rinse FM, or my friend Kira, who was a booking agent and who eventually took me on. Another thing that helped me a lot in my career was some associations I'd made from very early on. So I'd met some cool, like-minded artists that I admired and that I wanted to work with. For example, VTSS, Hector Oaks, Shem, and 1985 from Herrensauna. I also was very careful with choosing my bookings and my podcasts and picking the ones that were most aligned with what I wanted to do, which was this more fresh and modern, less strict take on techno. And I think it's important to kind of curate your path a little bit when you're starting out. And if you can afford it, don't say yes to everything. So to sum it up, the things that helped me on my career path was taking my own initiatives to launch my own projects, some connections that I had made from being just a raver, a wider range of experience, so legitimate raves, illegal raves, radio, sound system setup, some associations that I made with other similar artists, making the right decisions along the way, as well as having a slightly different sound from a wider range of influences. So I haven't mentioned my influences yet, but I'll talk about it now. So basically, I grew up with a brother playing loud and obnoxious Eurotrance, intentionally blasting his speakers against my bedroom wall just to annoy me. So all I could hear was this muffled thumping kick and bass. And I think that eventually led to my affinity for harder kick drums. But before that, in my teenage years, I was listening to a bit of everything. A lot of R&B, some pop, some indie. I went through so many different phases and nothing really ever stuck until I eventually landed on techno. My first foray into electronic music, though, was through UK-based music, thanks to my best friend at university in Leeds. So there was a lot of dubstep, some grime, some future garage, some old school garage, some jungle, UK funky, etc. So these days, I'm continuing the work with my label. I'm working on my own release, as well as having some fresh stuff coming out fairly soon, hopefully. Also have some exciting gigs coming up, if the pandemic allows it, of course. So Exit Festival, Voltage Festival, Aquacella. I'm also still hoping for my Berghain Club Knack debut. It was scheduled for March last year, and it was the first gig of mine to be cancelled because of the pandemic. So gutted. So hopefully that will still happen. I played their third room, the smaller one, Soile, plenty of times, but never the real deal, and it's every DJ's dream. So that's a bit about my background. So let's get on with the masterclass. So in this masterclass, I will first go through the very basics, the principles of how DJing works. And after that, I will do a quick demo on the turntables before I dive into Rekordbox and how I organize and set up my digital music for playing on the CDJs. So then I'll do a demo of how I use my hot cues on the CDJs. And after that, move on to some 3-deck mixing, some tips and tricks, and then tips for emerging DJs. So I want to take you through just the basic principles of DJing, just in case you're a complete beginner. If you do have some experience with DJing, feel free to skip ahead, as this will be fairly basic. So in my opinion, the 4 key things to DJing are track selection, which is most important, beat matching, timing, and EQing. So let's start with beat matching, as I will talk more about track selection later on. So basically the goal here is to create a continuous stream of music from one deck to the other without stopping. But all music has a different tempo. We call it beats per minute, or BPM. So what you want to do is match up the tempo of the incoming track to the outgoing, and I will call them so. So incoming is the track we're about to mix in, outgoing is the track we're going to mix out. So to match up the incoming track with the outgoing track, we use the pitch faders, which will increase or decrease a track's BPM by up to ±8% on these Technics turntables. Beware that there are other models where you can switch from ±8 to ±16, or there are other models. And this same principle then applies to mixing on CDJs for digital music. So after we've beat matched a track that's incoming, we do that in headphones so no one else can hear. After we beat matched it, we want to get ready to throw the record in. And so we find the first beat on the record with the needle, and then we wait for the right time. So what is the right time? Well, to know that we follow the phrasing of the track that is already playing. So basically all music can be divided up into sections or phrases. And in techno, these phrases are very straightforward. They're made up of multiples of 8 bars, where a bar is 4 beats, unless the track is not in 4/4 time signature, but most techno is, so let's not complicate things. So then all changes, or most changes in techno, so where new elements come in, or where breakdowns come in, or where drops happen, they happen at multiples of 8 bars. So 8, 16, 32 bars. You will have that structure in most tracks. So because most tracks work like that, if you have one track that you're ready to throw in and you listen to the phrasing structure of the one already playing, you will know when to throw the record in. So after the change of a new phrase, when a new phrase happens, either you throw it in right when the new phrase happens, or you throw it in 8 bars after, 16 bars after, and then you should be doing okay. So the timing is also very important for your EQing decisions, when to know, like how to know when to EQ things out, or how to know when to pull the outgoing track out. You just follow this structure and it should be sounding fine. So I'm going to give you a little quick demo of this phrasing using this Mani D track. So I'll be counting the bars just for you to get a sense of it. 1, 2 bars, 3 bars, 4 bars, 5 bars, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 bars. Listen to the change. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bars, 6 bars, 7 bars, 8 bars, 9 bars, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. New phrase. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. New phrase. So you can hear Mani D, who made this track, he follows a very rigid 16 phrase structure. In the middle there was some filtering effects right at the end of a 16-bar phrase, just to kind of signify the start of a new phrase. And I will call that sort of transition sounds. You will have some filtering effects. Sometimes there's like a new symbol that hits on the first beat of a new phrase. And that's what I like to call transition sounds. So then, because most tracks follow the structure, it's fairly easy to know when to throw the record in. Then when it comes to EQing, you have the EQs that basically cut the frequency, to cut the level of certain frequency ranges, and you use that to blend nicely the two tracks together so that you don't have too much high frequencies, too much mids, or too much lows. And once you've thrown the record in, you adjust those to make them fit nicely, and then you get ready to pull the outgoing one out, and then you've successfully completed a blend. So let's start with the beat matching now. You hear a lot of people say that they use the hi-hats or the kick drums to beat match, meaning that that's the elements that they pay attention to hear which track is ahead, which is behind, and what direction you need to adjust the pitch faders. I have a slightly different method that maybe I'll call macro versus micro beat matching. And don't worry, it's not as fancy as it sounds. All it means is that when I'm beat matching, I first try to get a crude beat matching by paying attention to whatever elements there are available that repeat over the course of one whole bar. Because if you're paying attention to individual drum hits, it's really hard to hear which one is ahead and which one is behind, because you need to be able to distinguish exactly what drums belong to which track and hear exactly which happens first. So I get my crude beat matching done by listening to whatever synth line that repeats over a bar, or if there's a vocal or a percussion hit that hits once a bar. And it helps me to listen to both tracks over the course of a bar and compare those bar-long sections. This is basically because if you have any difference in the BPM between two tracks, then the difference in time lag will be much smaller on an instantaneous drum hit or over 2 beats than it is over 4 beats. So any lag will become more apparent. If you try to focus to like a longer period of time, it can be difficult to get this at first, but let me show you what I mean on the turntables. So I'm gonna play a track and try to beat match on the system another track using this method. And it's going to be very messy to start with, because usually you would do this in your headphones, so bear with me. Also, on this record, there's like a synth line repeats over one bar, and on the other, there's a vocal that hits on the first beat of every bar. So I'll be listening to those to hear which I need to adjust in and in what way. So let's play this track. So you hear this synth line. Da, 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 da. So first I'm going to find, and I'm going to do this on the system, so it's going to be messy. I'm going to find the first beat. There's the first beat. Let me skip to the vocal actually. So you hear now the vocal is hitting somewhat close on the first beat. So once I have them crudely matched like that, that's when I pay attention to the drums to get it accurate. So I'm going to go ahead and do this blend now from this deck to the other. So I'll be using some of the EQs and some of the filters also. So let's do this. And you'll be able to hear when this track drops, because the key changes of this synth line right before the drop. So that's signaling the drop, so I know when to throw this record in. So I haven't actually spent any time properly beat matching this, so I might need to be adjusting a lot. Now. So as you noticed also, as I'm doing my beat matching and during my blending, I'm nudging the records forwards or backwards. And there are many ways you can do this. To nudge the record backwards, the best way is always to put your finger gently on the platter, just to temporarily slow it down. And then if you have to do that a lot, just obviously adjust the pitch fader downwards to slow it down. To push the record forward, I like to use my fingertips on the label in the middle, but you can also twist the spindle forward, which needs more force for the same amount of change. So it's slower, but also a bit more accurate. I also see some people brushing the side of the record forward, and personally I've never quite understood that method because it requires less force for the same amount of change, so it's more sensitive to touch, meaning it's much easier to fuck up. But it works for some people, so try it. So as you noticed in my blend also, mainly what I did was wait for the right time to swap the bass over, and then with the other EQs I just balanced it out a little bit, started taking out some of the outgoing, and then right in time for the breakdown, I was slowly filtering the bass synth out, so I only had the hi-hats playing over the breakdown and then slowly filtered those out right in time for the drop on this one. And this works really well to follow the natural structure of the tracks when you're doing these changes because it sounds quite smooth. And then if you take this out right in time for the breakdown or right in time for the drop, then when this drops, you get that burst of energy, so you don't feel the loss of the outgoing track and you're hit by that energy and you haven't lost any momentum. So with DJing, this is actually what I'd say is the hardest thing, is not losing momentum when you're taking elements out. It can be very noticeable when you take anything out. And this is where you will need to be EQing and filtering and doing this with a little bit of tact so as not to notice the loss of the elements. So bear in mind also that if the outgoing track, the more heavily EQ'd or filtered it is, the less you will notice it when you fade it out. So use the EQs and the filters to lower the levels and frequency ranges to get ready to fade it out. Another word of caution is that our brains can only process so much sonic information at once. So the smoothest mixes are the ones where you don't have two bass lines dropping at the same time as other groove changes or more hi-hats coming in, simply because if you have too many changes happening at once, our brains will not be able to process it all and we will be overwhelmed and it will throw us out of the groove, which is not what you want on the dance floor. So with the EQs, in general, if you have too much lows, it will sound like boomy or a bit muddy. If you have too much mids, it can sound hollow or a bit muddy again, depending on which mid you're using. If you have too much highs, in general, that will sound harsh or piercing. I mean, I can just show you, basically. This is with the bass boosted. This is with the lower mid, bass boosted, upper mid, and highs. So this mixer also has a 4-band EQ mixer, 4-band EQ, sorry, which means that the mids is separated into lower mids and upper mids. So I use the lower mids sometimes to get rid of the knocking of the kick drum if I'm mixing a track out. I can use it on like some bass leads or other synth parts in that area to highlight it if I want to keep that in as I'm mixing a track out. So for you producers out there, it might be helpful to know that the lower mids is a bell EQ centered at 250 Hertz, whereas the upper mids is centered at 2 kilohertz. So I don't want to talk too much about things that are very specific to this particular mixer, because I'm aware that not everyone uses this mixer. I do want to mention, though, the pre-post EQ button, which is the lifesaver to hear to help you hear which track is ahead and which is behind, especially for mixing vinyl. So the pre-post EQ button, situated here, it allows you to cue the signal in your headphones before the EQs. So even if you've EQ'd loads of frequencies out, you can hear them all in your headphones. So to hear which is ahead and which is behind, it's very handy. Also, another thing to mention is if you're using the low pass or the high pass filter, sorry, you need to have this resonance knob somewhere at the 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock position to not hear the high pass filter when you're turning the filter on. And if you're not familiar with filters, they essentially serve the same purpose as the EQs in that they take out certain frequency ranges from your mix. But instead of the EQs that are centered at one position and only changing the value, the level of that certain frequency range, the filter allows you to sweep across the frequency range, which can be interesting. It can be good to have the opportunity to use both. Okay, so I'll show you how I organize and set up my record box before I take you through a demo of how that works in practice. So in my record box, as a first note actually, the more organized you are with tagging your music and organizing your music into playlists, the quicker and easier you will find the music on the CDJ. So it's worth spending that time. So if we start now by going through how I organize my playlists, I have all of my playlists organized by year, first of all. And then within every year, I will have it organized into monthly folders. Bear in mind here that this monthly folder, it only has April for 2021 because I haven't had any gigs because of the pandemic. So I will organize everything in monthly folders, but I won't have a folder for every month of the year because I will keep adding to my monthly folder for 2 or 3 months until I have too many tracks in my playlist so it's hard to find stuff, or until I've played the tracks too often that I need to renew it. So I will only have some of the months of the year. And then in every monthly folder, I have another folder for gigs, where I have one playlist per gig, and these playlists contains the tracks that I'm most excited to play that specific gig. And this can be for multiple reasons. You know, the new stuff that I've imported that week that I'm the most excited to play, the bangers. It could be because of a specific time slot, who I'm playing before, who I'm playing after. It can be because of what I played in that city before, because I don't want to repeat myself too much. So I have playlists for every gig here, and I will play a lot of the tracks in these playlists at that gig. Then, in this structure here, I have a bunch of playlists with more tracks in them, and these are the playlists that I reuse for every gig, and I keep adding to them until it's time to renew and reset. So some of these playlists contain tracks that work well together, that I would play a bunch of in one run. So for example, the industrial playlist or the trance playlist. But then some playlists are playlists of tracks that I need just to be able to find one specific thing quickly. For example, my starters playlists that contain starting options, or my different playlists that contains interesting curveballs, my elements playlists, don't ask me why I've named it that, but it contains emotionally loaded tracks or standout tracks for other reasons. I have a resters playlist that I use whenever the dance floor needs a bit of a rest. I have an enders playlist and an encores playlist, and they're self-explanatory. So that's how I organize my music for playing gigs. And then in this outside structure, I have another folder for podcasts, radio and streams, for preparing those so that I can refer back to them if I want to know what I played in a certain podcast or whatever. Then I always also have an inbox playlist, and that's where I will import all of my music before I sort it into my playlists so that I can still play these tracks even if I haven't taken the time to put them in their respective playlists, or if I haven't put the hot cues on there yet, I can still put them on the stick and play them because I don't always use the hot cues. So let's jump straight into this folder that I made here specifically for this masterclass, where I have hot cue demos. This track is already loaded, so I'm going to show you then my hot cue system. So on the Pioneer CDJ 2000 Nexus 2, which is the model that I currently use, the hot cues are organized into 4 buttons with 2 banks, so you switch between the 2 banks. And this means that I have my hot cues organized so that A and E perform the same function, B and F perform the same function, C and G similar functions, D and H, etc. So that I know which button always performs the same function. I just need to switch between the 2 banks. So A and E are dedicated to my mix-in loops. So I'll have these loops set up so that when I exit the loop, something new will happen. And on this track, for example, I have it set up so that when I exit this loop, there's a 2-bar structure, 2-bar structure, and then new hi-hats come in. And then my mixing loop E has hi-hats, and then when I exit it, you have this transition sound, and then a drop. Then if you see here my B and F, I don't actually have any loops here, but they are my mix out loops. And in this particular track, I couldn't find any loops I thought that I would actually use, so I didn't put any in there because too many hot cues, if you're not going to use them, it's a waste of time setting them. I'll show you my mix out loops on another track. So my C and my G are then usually longer loops that I can use to jump back to a section. If I'm at the end of the track and I want to play the track for longer, I can jump back to C. And then they're also set up so that I can jump from C to G and take out elements in the process. See there, the vocal was taken out simply by a hot cue jump. So I can take elements out without resorting to the EQs, because using the EQs, it's never a perfect solution. You're not able to isolate the sounds the way you would want to do. So I use my hot cues to mix out tracks, and I can take out elements that way. And this loop C also serves a separate function in that I can play this track and skip the breakdown if I want to. So I'll usually set my C or my G loops to serve a separate function. Then my D and my H are what I call skip to positions. So I use these mainly to be able to jump to a breakdown. So if I'm playing this track with another track and the breakdown is approaching on the other track, I can skip to the breakdown of this one to align them, which is good for dynamics because you don't necessarily always want to have another track with a kick drum and everything playing underneath the breakdown of another track. So I can skip to this little mini breakdown here with D, or skip to the real breakdown with H. And if you look at my mixing loops here, A and E, they have this sort of turquoise, green, blue color, and that is for whenever I have a mix-in loop of 2 bars, I exit, and then you have transition sounds, and then the change happens. There are, for example, this track here, I have a mix-in loop that is more like a light blue, and that signifies that as soon as I exit the loop, you have a change. let's show it with this one. So more hi-hats coming in. So in this track, I also have it set up so that I can use my mixing loop A if I want to start simple without the melody, with just some drums, or I can use my mixing loop E if I want to mix in with that melody. So here I also have mix out loops. So you hear this melody with elements, and then what if I jump to F now? You hear the same melody, but just taking out the hi-hats and everything, so no need for EQs. And in this track, I also have my H here, colored in purple, in pink, which means that it's the end of a track, jump to, which usually has the reverb tail, the delay tails of a track, so it sounds a lot smoother. Instead of fading the track out, if you jump to that end point, you're not losing the reverb and delay tails that you would if you just faded the track out. So I use that a lot, especially in podcasts when you want to be more smooth. In the club, maybe probably no one would notice. But it does sound a lot smoother. So let's try another track. Here again, I have a mixing loop, and if I exit the loop, then 2 bars, there's a transition sound, and then it drops. In this track, I also have that end of track, jump to point H, colored pink, but this track has a very long reverb and delay tail, so I could even use this playing over another track, playing it over again as an accent. And in this track I also have this loop E here. This would usually be my mixing loop, but I've colored it moss green to signify that this is in the wrong place. I wouldn't use this as a mixing loop, but because I ran out of hot cues and I wanted to be able to skip the breakdown, I put it there. So let's jump to a track that I'm going to use for my demo later. I'm going to show you how I use these hot cues in practice. Here I have a mixing loop A that's colored orange. So that means that the track, when I exit the loop, there's no change, but I didn't want to put the loop before the change because this track has a bit of a delayed kick drum, and it's hard to actually get the track in time so that when you exit the loop and the kick drum hits in, it's not always going to be in time. So I used this other mix-in loop here. But the same principle, B to jump to a mix to a breakdown, H to jump to a breakdown, and here. B I will use as a mixed out loop, and you hear the percussion, you hear the hi-hats, but if I jump to F, it's just that droning background, so I can essentially get rid of so many elements without using the EQs, and it sounds a lot smoother. Let's do another example. And as you can see, I don't always add all of the hot cues because it takes a lot of time. So this track, which is my own track, if you listen to this loop, it's not actually perfect because I have that kick fill in the low end that I wouldn't necessarily want to repeat, but because I'm bringing this track in anyway with the low EQs turned down, it's less of an issue. So when I exit the loop, you have a bit of a transition sound and then more hi-hats coming in. And the same here, exit the loop, and that percussion is coming in. So in this track, I've colored this. This is usually, this hot cue D here, this is usually jump 2 hot cue, but in this case I've colored it purple to signify that this can be used for multi-purpose things. I can use this in many different ways. I can use this as a skip to breakdown, but it's also a loop so that I can just play this percussion over a different track if I want to. But it's also a mix-in loop, because if I exit this loop now, you'll get that synth lead. So I can use it as a mix-in loop also. And then I have my mix-out loops, this one, and F, takes out those hats and the vocal. And then I can use my H to exit. I mean, that was the end of the track anyway, but I can even use it anywhere else in the track. Here, for example, and just take it out. And it sounds so smooth. So I just forgot to mention here that I also have a folder for history, which contains the history from my USB sticks from all the gigs that I play, and that's very handy because sometimes if you're playing several times in the same city, you want to remember what you've played before so as not to repeat yourself too much. But also if you're playing long sets, you may be drinking. Sometimes you wake up the next day and you just want to know what you actually played because sometimes you don't remember. So one last thing to mention with my hot cues. This track, it has a very abrasive part in the middle that I do sometimes play, it just doesn't work for all occasions. So I have my jump to here, D, colored in blue with another memory cue colored in blue so that I know that when I reach that memory cue here, I jump to D, so I skip this entire section in the middle where there's this very abrasive part. So let me play it for you. It's very abrasive. I like it, but not for all occasions. So instead, I have it set up so that when it reaches this point, I'll skip to this acid line, which is beautiful. I have another point here, purple, to jump to this purple G, because there's another bit of abrasiveness in here. So yeah, that's my hot cues. So now I will move on to showing you how I would actually mix using these hot cues on the CDJs. So now I'm going to take you through how I would use my hot cues in practice after you've seen me set them up in Rekordbox. And I'm going to do so by showing you two of the same tracks I showed you in Rekordbox. And I'm going to start this track somewhere near the end of the track where you would usually mix the track out. And I'm going to start this track with my mix in loop A and then exit the loop right in time for when I want those extra hi-hats to come in. So let me jump close to the end here. I'll bring this in. So A. And I'm going to bring this track in at the start of the next phrase, whilst also lowering the EQs of the outgoing one. So now I want those extra hi-hats. I'm getting ready to jump to my mix out loop B. So I jumped to mix out loop F, and now I'm going to actually jump back to B just to get some hi-hats into that breakdown, the mini breakdown. And then back to F. And now filter it out. So that now when this track hits again, when it drops, you won't feel the loss of the outgoing one. You haven't lost any momentum, just from clever timing and some filtering. I'll just wait for the drop for you to hear. So yeah, no loss in momentum. I was also, at the same time as I was using the high pass filter, I was playing with the high EQ a little bit, just because if you're using only the high pass filter, it can be a bit static. But if you use the high EQ, you can get sort of like both a high pass filter and a low pass filter at the same time, and it can sound a little bit more fun, basically. So one other feature on the CDJs that I use a lot is the beat jump feature. And you can use it to skip ahead or skip backwards up to 16 beats. So it's very handy for, like, say you're playing this track here, and there's a breakdown coming up, but you don't want to play the breakdown yet. So you use the beat jump and jump back 16 beats. You can jump back 8 beats on this track also. On this track, I wouldn't advise jumping back 4 beats, because this droney synth in the background repeats over 2 bars, not 1 bar. So listen what happens if I press back 4 beats. I mean, you could use that as a feature if you wanted to, but... So I use that beat jump feature a lot. You can also use it to skip ahead, obviously. So if this breakdown was playing and I wanted the drop to come sooner, press the forward. So this is very handy for realigning tracks if the phrasing has got out of alignment. This happens sometimes when producers sort of throw in like a little cute 2-bar phrase or a 4-bar phrase, and suddenly the alignment isn't perfect. So you can use it also to kind of double drop 2 tracks, so you can have the drops happening at the same time. Or yeah, if you're reaching a section that you don't want to play yet, you can skip backwards. Just a word of caution, be a bit mindful when you're using this. As I showed you already, if you have the track, some very standout element, like this droney synth in this track is repeating over 2 bars, then you have to use the beat jump feature in multiples of 2 bars, so 8 or 16. Not the 2 or 4. This is confusing because I'm using the bar to speak, but this is the beats, not the bars. But yeah, also be mindful that if there is certain synth elements that are sort of, there's a lot of movement or automation in the sound, so filters opening up in the track, then skipping with the beat jump feature might sound unnatural. So be mindful of that, but it's a very handy feature. So two more cute features that I wanted to mention are the polyrhythmic loop feature and the slip reverse, because I do use both of those also. So I'm going to show you first the polyrhythmic loop feature. I'm sure you're familiar with looping just a 4-bar or 8-bar loop, but 4 beat or 8 beats, sorry. Getting confused again. So I'm going to play another track here, mix in a second track, and then I'm actually going to, on this deck, I'm going to first jump to my mix out loop B, then mix out loop F, and then in my mix out loop F, I'm going to exit the loop and actually create 3-beat loop rather than a 4-beat loop. And you'll be able to hear that percussion sound hitting in a polyrhythmic 3-beat way. So now I'll start this track somewhere near the end where you would usually mix out. So I'm ready with my mixing loop A here. I'm going to bring it in at the start of the new phrase. So I already jumped to my mix out loop B, and now I'm going to jump to my mix out loop F. So now you hear that percussion repeating every 3 beats. So yeah, that's a little bit about the polyrhythmic loop feature. So I chose this track because it's a little bit more hypnotic with, it just works quite well with polyrhythmic loops. So there you go with that. And the other feature that I wanted to show you is the slip reverse. So I'm going to change tracks again. I'm going to actually let this one playing, but I'm going to mixing in another track that I'm choosing because it works really well with the slip reverse. So actually, let's jump to this one again. And again, I'm going to jump to close to the end of the track where you would normally mix out. So the reason I chose this track to show the slip reverse feature is because it has a lot of driving hi-hats, and that works really well with the slip reverse. So what the slip reverse does, I didn't actually mention that, it reverses the track. So let me play it. But then when you release it, it takes you back to the part in the waveform where you would have been if you didn't use the reverse. There's also just a normal reverse. But when you exit it, it will be where you've reversed to. So it's really handy to use a slip reverse to keep the phrasing to still be in time. And like I said, it works really well for driving hi-hats like this. You can use it on other tracks also, but it sounds really good with the driving hi-hats. And you hear a lot of producers use this reverse feature in their production right before the start of a new phrase. They'll have some hi-hats or some other percussion, usually hi-hats to be honest, reverse. So you can kind of imitate some of these transition sounds that producers use in their production on the CDJs. So while two-deck mixing usually is more of a simple transition between one track and another, three-deck mixing, especially if you use a lot of hot cues, can sometimes be a little bit reminiscent of how a live artist plays a live set, in that you can imagine the DJ mixer a little bit like a mixing desk, but on a very miniature scale, of course, where each channel features one or usually a group of elements. So say you have the kick drum from one track and a synth line from another and hi-hats from another, and you can play with that and create something new. If you want an example of this, you can watch my latest Her Radio set from the 2nd of April. I unfortunately don't have time to go through that also, as I have more to show you, but you can look at that Her Radio set from about just after the 15-minute mark. It's on YouTube, where I'm mixing the kick and bass and like some mids from a track by Time Traveler called WDGF, mixed with some vocal sounding percussion from a track that's coming out on my label soon, and then mixed with a clap and a siren sounding synth from Jensen Interceptor City Girls. And I'm looping all three tracks for a little while. So I'm creating something kind of completely new with 3 channels, and every channel has its own sort of sound. So that's one way to approach 3-deck mixing, where you create something completely new and you're looping the tracks. You can also do it a little bit simpler than that. You can approach it by just adding an extra percussive layer or a vocal loop on the 3rd deck, and then mixing on the other 2 as you would normally. So let me show you how that could work, and I'll do that by playing the same 2 tracks as I already did, so you can hear the difference with the vocal track on top. So I'll start this track then again somewhere near the end where you would usually mix out. yeah, so that's one way that you can add an extra vocal loop and then mixing two tracks into each other as usual. The way I actually end up doing it most frequently, though, is by simply looping the one that is outgoing instead of bringing it out as you would do if you're mixing with two decks. And that eliminates the problem of the loss of momentum when you're bringing elements out, at least initially, because you're not bringing it out. You're looping it and keeping it in. It's also quite easy to do because you don't have to do any planning for your 3-deck blends. It just simply happens on the spot, like you would usually mix it out, but you find a loop and you like it with the currently playing track, so you keep it in and then bring in another one on the 3rd deck. So let me do one quick demo of that also. So in this situation, I'll start this track somewhere near the end, again, where you would normally mix out. Okay, yeah, you get the gist. So there are some pros and cons to mixing with 3 decks. Like I mentioned before, one of the hardest things with mixing is taking elements out without losing momentum. And with 3-deck mixing, this is much less of a problem because you can compensate for the loss of energy in one channel with the gain of energy in another. And also you have plenty more options for elements to keep in there. So there's more elements, and when you're taking something out, you don't necessarily miss it. So that's a huge pro in my opinion. You can also tease things in, or like easier or over longer periods of time, which makes it a little bit more creative and fun. You can also add extra flair or just extra, percussions, or just a little bit extra to your mixing or to your blends that make your DJing more personal and more original. You can even create almost like mashups with 2 tracks and completely new tracks that don't exist anywhere else but in your mixing. So either in the podcast or in your sets if you reuse that 3-deck blend. And that makes it very special. I have to say though, as a word of caution, 3-deck mixing easily gets very messy. It's a lot harder to hear which one is ahead, which is behind. So adjusting, you need to know which deck and in what direction. So it can easily sound like train wrecks. You need a little bit of practice. Another huge downside to 3-deck mixing is the fact that if you're having 3 channels playing at once, you can very easily mask the dynamics of a track. So you want to pay attention to the natural ups and downs of the tracks to have a little bit of rest times and a little bit more energetic times. So keep an eye on the dynamics and make sure you're not mixing with 3 decks on full blast for too long at a time, because it very quickly gets tiring. It also is harder to do the EQing, of course. You need to use your ears to not oversaturate certain frequency ranges. And if you're not looping your tracks, you need to pay more attention to the phrasing to make sure you're not having these transition sounds happening all over the place. So to sum it up, 3-deck mixing can very quickly become too much. Even I'm guilty of that a lot of the time. I get overexcited and a bit carried away, but it's cool to experiment. And yeah, just follow the general rule, less is more, and you'll be fine. So I'll now go through some of my tips and tricks. So one of the first tips that I have for you is to adapt your mixing style. Practice many different ways of mixing. For example, like this track that I played a little bit of earlier. This track, I would say, is a bit more hypnotic. It changes a little bit slower. So this track is a track that I would usually do slower blends with the EQs more smoothly if I'm mixing that kind of track into it. Whereas a track like this one that I played earlier, this one works a little bit more for chopping. Like you saw me earlier, take out the other tracks when that ping happens. So adapt your mixing style to the style of techno that you're playing, or the style of music in general. Another thing I would like to mention is that drifting mixes, like when they're not in perfectly in time and you have to adjust a little bit, that's not necessarily so much of a bad thing on the dance floor, because if you're mixing completely perfectly, no one on the dance floor will be able to tell when you're mixing. And a lot of people on the dance floor, they don't really understand exactly what happens. So when they hear drifting mixes, they know that you're mixing and they know what you're doing. And then when you put it back in time, they get really excited and they cheer, and it infuses a lot of energy onto the dance floor. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. So I mentioned chopping earlier, and I have a few tips of when to do it, when not to do it. So for example, with that track with the ping, it works to chop the other tracks out. To hear that ping is quite effectful, but in general, I played these tracks before. This one, hot cues are loading, it takes a little bit of time. So you have this droning synth in the background. And it's kind of like a continuous sound rather than the drums, which are instantaneous hits. Sometimes you might have a little bit of reverb. But if you chop this, and I did in my mixes, if you want to go back and listen, I did in a couple of places, but it's very audible when you chop something that has a continuous sound over it. Whereas if you chop something that only has drum hits, individual drum hits, it's less audible. It's still effectful, but it's less audible. So keep in mind that chopping, when you have pads or strings or anything, it will sound a little bit unnatural. Maybe you want that effect sometimes, but yeah, so that's a little tip to help you know when to chop and when to not. Another tip that I have is for making BPM changes. So I'll show you one tip for this, which is using the sync button. Don't laugh at me, yeah. But if you, let's say we're playing this track now. Sorry, there we go. Mixed in. We have that as the master, this one on the sync. Okay, so that wasn't a super smooth example, but you can put one as a master, put the other as a sync, and then it works best to have them in the breakdown when you don't have drums hitting, to just put the pitch up on the one that is the master and the synced one will follow. And the reason you would do that during a breakdown section is because if you don't have the drum hits sounding, then it will be less audible with the pitch change. So I was a little bit stressed there. I didn't actually use the right hot cue anyway, but that's one way you could use the sync button to change the BPM fairly quickly. And if you're playing only on 2 decks, this isn't so much a problem because you can just use the pitch fader during the breakdown of one before you mix in the other. But if you're playing 3-deck blends and you want to change the BPM and there's not really any time when you have only one track playing, that's a good trick to remember. So if you're playing 2 decks, there's another way you can change the BPM very quickly, and that is to use tracks that have an ambient intro and mix it in with the track that has an ambient outro and an ambient intro. So I'll quickly jump to an example of this. So say you've been playing this track and it's at 130 BPM and you want to jump quickly to, sorry, it was synced still. You want to jump to 140 BPM. So again, I'll jump to the end of this track right before the ambient outro, and then I'll mix in the ambient intro on this deck. So as you could tell, I didn't even touch the EQs because both the ambient outro and the ambient intro worked quite well together. There was one point where I touched the hotkey button, and that's only because there was a section in this intro that jumped into some drums, but I wanted it to kick in with the kick straight away, so I'd set that hotkey up beforehand. So that's two ways that you can quickly change the BPM whilst you're mixing. So now I'll go on to some track selection tips. As I mentioned at the very start of the masterclass, track selection is, in my opinion, the most important. And if you do your track selection very carefully, you can get the elements to sit around each other, both in the frequency space, but also in the stereo space. So that's more important for podcasts where people will listen with headphones and hear the stereo space properly. But yes, if you can get the track selection right in both the frequency spectrum and the stereo space, then you don't really need to do much EQing and they will sound perfectly together. So one of my main tips for track selection is to try to create some call and response. So you'll have a synth line on one deck, or like a percussion or a vocal thing that happens on one beat in a bar, and then on the other there's a call and response. So like one element happens and then the other track responds with something else. So I like that a lot. But some general tips for track selection is to pay attention to the style of tracks. So like the genre of the music you're playing. If you're playing techno, there's still a lot of subgenres. So a lot of DJs play the same genre. I'm not one of those. I will mix like a lot of different styles of techno together. And I often do that by mixing sort of like one driving track with one that is less driving, kind of more industrial, but maybe they have the same sound of the synth. So they still work together. So pay attention to the style of techno that you're playing, the style of sounds. And then another thing I pay attention to a lot is the drive of the track. So maybe I have an example of that here. So we could do this track, for example. Oh no, let me go back, sorry, and do this track. So I'll play two tracks by the same producer, so they have very similar sounds, but the drive is completely different. So this track now, I'll match the BPM of them also, so that you won't hear any difference in energy level purely from the difference in BPM. So you hear this, it has quite a lot of energy. And then listen to this one. So this is not the same BPM, but it's not quite as forceful or forward driving. And it's got a lot to do with some of the hi-hats, but also with the low-end drive, with whether it's more of a dry kick drum or a wet kick drum with like a tail that hits on the offbeat. So this has more of a forward drive, and it's mostly to do with that low end. So if you want to mix something and you're mixing and you want to infuse more energy, then go for something that has more drive in the low end, and it will hit the crowd with some more energy. Another thing to keep in mind that is similar to that is groove. I mean, drive is a type of a groove, but there's drive that you can have in the percussion, groove that you can have in the percussion, and different grooves might not fit together, whereas other different grooves work. Then you can pay attention to the hardness of the track. For example, like how hard is the kick drum, and do you want to play many hard tracks in a row? Probably not. Another thing to keep in mind is the arrangement or the progression in the track. Is the track more slowly building, or does it have a lot of changes happening all the time? So if you're playing tracks that have more of a slow build, you might want to continue on that vibe for a while to kind of build a slow momentum. And you might not want to go for the track that has so many changes all the time, because you will kind of overwhelm the crowd. So another thing to keep in mind is how busy is the track, how many elements. This is kind of related to the previous point I was making, but how many elements are happening in the track? Is it like busy in all the frequency like in the frequency ranges? Because if you're playing a lot of tracks with a lot of material, a lot of hi-hats, the mix is really busy, and suddenly you're bringing in a sparse track, it might sound empty. So then you would need to pay more attention to your like EQing and filtering, maybe do these like long transition sound imitations with the filter before you bring that sparse one in, otherwise you will lose the momentum. So another big thing is mixing in key, and a lot of people talk about this, and I would say that the best way to do this is to just use your ear. Rekordbox offers key analysis within Rekordbox, and this is accurate to some extent if you are playing all of the tracks at 0 pitch. As soon as you are pitching the tracks, the key no longer is the same, because it depends on the pitch. The pitch doesn't only affect the tempo, it affects the key of the track. So there is a workaround. You can try, there's a master tempo button here that will take the key of the track back to the key of the track before you pitched it. So if you really want to play a track but it's out of key, you can listen, try the master tempo button, see if it's suddenly in key, then you can use it. But as a word of caution, I wouldn't use the master tempo button if you pitched the track very far from its 0 point, because you can get weird artifacts and it might not sound very good. So another thing to keep in mind that I do quite a lot is the mood of the track, or the emotion of the track. So I have another few examples here. So this again, I have 3 examples, and they're all by the same producer. They all have very similar like sounds, sound design, and structures, but to me they all have very different emotions. So let's play this one first. Let me skip ahead a bit so you can hear that pad. So the way I classify this is kind of in my head thinking, what kind of a movie scene would this be a soundtrack to? So in my head, this might sound a bit silly, but in my head, this track would soundtrack sort of like a panicked flight from danger, or a very determined, speedy chase after something vital. It's sort of, there's a rush and there's some urgency to it. So if I then play the next track by the same producer, so as you can hear, it sounds fairly similar in the sound design and everything, but this one doesn't have the same rush and urgency. This one is more sort of like a curious chase for something. You're like, you keep looking and you keep looking, and there are some clues there. It's quite mystical. There's some discovery there. So then to the next examples, again, the same producer, very similar sound design. Oh, let me skip ahead. I think I skipped a little bit too far ahead, so you didn't hear all of those beautiful synths. But to me, this is a very high intensity kind of resolution. So it would be a climax track to play. So some other keywords that you can use or think about when you're categorizing the mood or the emotion of the track is like rising tension, danger, fight, resolution, sentimental, sad, beautiful, fun, naughty, dissolving tension, restart, beginning of journey or end of journey, etc. Just make up your own keywords. And it will help you sort of select a track that will fit the mood of the dance floor. If you want a bit of a climax, then go for a climactic track, simple as that. So another thing that I wanted to mention is, I mentioned the master tempo button already, but you can also use the master tempo button more in a creative way. So let's jump to let's use this track that I used before already. So say I'm playing this track already. So the usual loop of this track would be this. But say I wanted to I'm using the master tempo. So I'm looping this. Only the first section of that melodic loop, but I'm using the master tempo to change the key of it, so I can essentially create my own little melody. So you can use the master tempo creatively like that. Just bear in mind that you need it to be pitched quite far from its original to hear the difference. If you have the pitch very close to zero, there won't be much of a key change. One thing I also would like to mention is that club mixing can be very different from the way you mix in podcasts or for radio or for live streams, because people on the dance floor tend to have a much longer attention span thanks to being intoxicated of various different things. So you can take your time and do longer mixes. You don't have to be so quick on the dance floor, whereas in podcasts and radio and live streams, you might want to mix quicker purely because of the difference in attention span. So my final point in this section then is managing the energy on the dance floor and how to know when to crank up the energy or when to slow it down. And the best tip I have for this actually is to just go out and experience the dance floor as much as you can. Go to raves, both sober and not sober, and spend as much time as you can on the dance floor, not in the toilet cubicle, because this will build an intuition for when the dance floor needs more energy and when it needs more of a rest. The longer you spend doing this, the better your intuition will be. Most of the time when I'm playing in a club or at a festival, mostly so in a club, I will tap into my own feeling, this intuition that I've built up over years and years of being a raver. So I will play for myself. What kind of energy trajectory would I want on the dance floor now? So you can spend time building this intuition, and then on top of the intuition, you can pay attention to your surroundings, pay attention to the crowd. Do they look bored? Do they dance vigorously? How busy is the dance floor? Pay attention to their screaming, pay attention to, are they on their phones? And most of the time, actually, I would say that if the crowd looks bored, it's not necessarily that you need to crank the energy level up. Because if you've been playing very high energy for a long time, maybe it's just the fact that the crowd needs a rest. So sometimes if the crowd looks bored, don't crank up the energy. If you've already been playing very energetic, maybe dip down in energy for a while and then see how the crowd responds once you go back up again, and you might be surprised. So one of my main tips for emerging DJs is don't be afraid of taking risks. Take risks when you're mixing. Even if you So one of my main tips for emerging DJs is don't be afraid of taking risks. Take risks when you're mixing. Even if you think you might fuck up, that's part of it and you'll get experience. And also by taking risks, you may be greatly rewarded. I take a lot of risks when I'm DJing. Sometimes I'm not entirely sure if the key of the track fits. Sometimes I'm not entirely sure what happens in the end of the track. But by taking these risks anyway, and not being scared of it, you sometimes create moments of magic that you wouldn't have otherwise, and you'll gain a lot of experience doing so. If you do fuck up, just shrug it off, move on. And if you don't look awkward, the crowd won't feel awkward. It's a lot about your aura. If you look like you're having fun, the crowd will have fun. So try to laugh it off, shrug it off, and move on. Another tip that I have for emerging DJs is for your digging. There's a lot of competition out there, and even producers who make the most amazing tracks struggle to get bookings. And for this, you need to sort of develop yourself as a DJ as well as a producer. So dig and dig and dig, and also dig in a lot of places that might be off the beaten track. Don't just look for your music in the most popular places like the Beatport Top 100. The more you dig in different places, the more you will develop your own original sound that will help you get those bookings. So definitely look at unusual places, unusual record shops, unusual websites, platforms. Don't just go for the top ones that everyone else is digging at. Because you need to have your own unique selling points to get those bookings. Also, it's very important to stay true to yourself and to be authentic. Even if you hear music that other people are making and it's what's trendy right now, it's what's getting other people booked,